In this module, you're going to learn about the Common Data Service for Apps, or CDS, because I do not want to say those words all the time. CDS is a data source, just like we've talked about other data sources at this point, but it's so much more than a data source, and that's what we'll learn about in this module. I want to show you all the features and why it's such a rich data source that in a perfect world, it's also the ideal environment to use with your Power Apps, whether that's going to be Canvas apps or the model-driven apps we're going to cover in the next module. When I say CDS is a data source, what does that really mean? Well, underneath the cover, CDS stores all of your data in SQL Server, but what a CDS does is provides a layer between you and SQL that makes your life much easier. If you've ever had to go into a SQL Server and design or lay out a table and data structures, you know that it's very clearly work for a DBA that us citizen developers should not be involved with. Not CDS. We're going to look at this great interface that is on top of the database that provides us all of the functionality we need and lets us do even more than we thought was possible. For example, CDS provides us a security layer. That way, when we're building our data security, we can define security roles at different layers, letting us be very granular in who can do what with our data. And speaking of controlling our data, we have business rules. Business rules let us define rules like when you enter data in one field, another field becomes required, which is powerful, but what makes it even more powerful is because you're applying this rule at the data layer, it goes with the data. So if you decide to leverage CDS as a data source for other business solutions, these rules will still be enforced, maintaining your data integrity. To get started with CDS, you need to learn about entities. And the easy way to understand what entities are is they are just tables of data. You define an entity that is your table, and then you define fields, which are the columns in the table, right? Columns are the information or metadata you want to have the users enter. I tell you what, instead of trying to describe the entities, let's just switch over to the browser and take a look at them. Over here in the browser, back at web.powerapps.com, we're going to click on Data and then Entities. And don't worry if you don't see this same thing right now. That's because we haven't created you an environment or the database for storing all this, which we're going to cover in a later module. But I just thought this was a better chance for us to kind of walk through and explain what we're about to create. What you're going to see when you click on Entities here is this is the Common Data Model, right? So CDS, the Common Data Service, comes pre-populated with all of the data from the Common Data Model, which is an open source Microsoft project that provides a bunch of standard entity and fields because everyone has the same needs, right? Or at least the same base needs to kind of get us started. So for example, if we go down here and click on Contact, you're going to see all the different fields that have been pre-provisioned, right? So a bunch of address fields, and it's just not, address, but it's street 1, street 2, and 3, and, multiple telephone numbers, lots of different field types that are available so that when we get in here, things like aging and business phones and company phones, a lot of those different types of fields that we need to create our data structures are already pre-provisioned. So that's one of the big advantages of CDS to me is that we have the access to the Common Data Model, which gets us moving in the right direction. And then what you're going to see is that all of these different field types, or all these different fields have different field types. So, things like do not allow faxes. That's 2 options. And if we were to drill into that, we'd see that would be a yes option or a no option. Who even knew faxes were still a thing? But all these different field types, email types and text and images and decimal numbers, all these different type of things go into making the structure that allows you to have a better experience and to make it easier for you to get started using the Common Data Service. And don't worry, these are the out-of-the-box ones, but we can definitely go in here to Contact. We can add a field, right? So we can extend the existing entities. Or if we go back to entities, we can create a new entity and then actually create our own ones for different things. And so as we go through this module, we're going to do this along the way so you can see what that looks like and go through that experience for yourself. If we go back to our contact entity, the next thing we could also look at here at the entity level is the relationships. And so with the relationships, what you can do is you can add relationships. And here you can define many-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many relationships. And this is most typically used when you want to do something like maybe you have one customer record, but you want to have multiple contacts at that customer. Then you can have a correlation between the two, right? And create that one-to-many relationship, giving you the ability to have the data structures and the relationships that you need. And when you add relationships to an entity, what will happen is the fields will come across and you'll be connected, right? We won't have to do anything. The CDS will just take care of the structure underneath so that all that data is interconnected for us. Works out pretty well and is really a nice advantage of building out solutions where, once again, you can not worry about the underlying structure. You can just say, hey, I need this entity to relate to this entity, and then Power Apps and CDS will take it from there. Next up, then you can go to the business rules. And so business rules allow us to define rules. And what's really neat about these rules is that it's at the data layer, so they're going to travel. Typically, when I think about building rules in my apps, I think about the app having all the business logic and all the rules, which is great if I'm the only one using the data structure in the app to define those things. But what you can do at CDS is we can define business rules here at this level, and they're going to go with the data no matter what. So whether it's me building a Power Apps app from this data or another user connecting to this data from Excel and trying to use the data, the business rules will always be enforced. And so we're going to look at those throughout the module. We're going to build some of those. But these are just those typical things where you say, if they add this field, right, or if they check this box, or they say it's this expense type, right, then we want to make these other fields required. And if not, those fields are optional. So those are the type of things that I think about with business rules, but they can do a lot more than that. But that's kind of getting our head wrapped around it as we do this overview here. Views, they're used with our friend, the model-driven apps, which we'll look at in the module after this. But we can define the views of our data. And so then when we consume them inside model-driven apps, we have complete access to those and we control how the data is presented back to the user. Pretty normal stuff there. Keys. Keys is where you can define, you want to have unique columns. So for example, maybe you're doing something like where you're tracking cars and you want to make the VIN, right, the vehicle identification number, the key. Then you can define that. If you don't define a key in your CDS entities, no problem. Under the cover, CDS has one that is a GUID that's set up for you, but you don't care. It's just know that CDS is keeping track of things for you as it needs. But sometimes you want to define and control the keys, so then you have the capability to come in here and do that. You also might use these keys when you're interacting with this data from an external data system, where you want to create relationships between the two, and you want to have some control over that. And then finally, the data tab here. This is just going to let you look at the data that you currently have in your entity. So you can make sure that there are some things here. You can see some examples and things like that. We'll do this like after we do an import of our data. We'll come in here and look at the data just to be like, yep, there's actually data. Because remember that CDS is just about building the data structure, the rules, the relationships, the keys, things like that. CDS does not provide a mechanism for us to go in here and edit this data or add individual rows and things like that. We're going to do that through one of the apps that we're going to build as we go throughout the rest of the course. And speaking of data, remember that CDS has some great ways to get data in. So we click on Get Data up here at the top, right? We can do Get Data from Excel, because typically one thing about pre-populating these things, it's just get some data out of Excel, especially in the beginning when you're just trying to get your hands around how this works. But as you get into more complex scenarios, we click on Get Data here. You'll see that I have all these different data sources that we can use to pull data into CDS to get it populated. And these aren't live connections though, right? This is a one-time import. We get the data in CDS, we move there, and we'll start taking advantage of all the powers of CDS. And one of the powers of CDS that I've failed to mention so far, shame on me, is security. So with CDS, not only can we set security at the entity level, but we can also set it at the row level. And because it's at the data level, we're not worried about when we let other people use CDS as a data source, that security will still be enforced because it's at the data level. So as I create these great data structures, they get more exciting. More people want to use them. They want to use them not only for Power Apps, but for other solutions. No problem. I know that all the business logic, all the business security that I need and I've enforced here at the data level will travel. And this is just one of those great things about CDS. So I think that's enough to get you guys excited. Hopefully you're as excited as I am to go through this module and learn about CDS. We're going to go through all the different examples and make sure you're comfortable with using this. And it's important just to understand this is a great data source. And as you get better at building your different Power Apps and business solutions, you're going to find the better your data source, the better your apps are. And you're probably going to figure out in the end that CDS is probably the best data source going for these apps. All right, so I think that's enough. Let's see you in the next module.